I scared him. And it's because I saw the emotional expression as great. Let's go for it. I didn't realize that both it was scary to him and then I had become the abusive mother. I forgot about transference. I just forgot about transference. Never forget about transference if you're a woman in the room with a man. There's always transference. You may be the sexualized lover, you may be the bad mother, you may be the good mother, you may be the good wife, bad wife, but you're a woman, and I think in therapy, you're not just a therapist, you're a female therapist. So I kind of forgot about, I don't like the negative transference. I don't want to be the bad mother, but sometimes we are. And then we have to be careful we don't go too far and not notice it, because then we'll scare our clients off. So I felt really bad because I had overwhelmed him, and I didn't realize it, because I was thinking, tears, good, pain, good. We're getting into the heart of it, and meanwhile, he's thinking, let me out of here, right? So view your client as a hero for coming into treatment, and I do this regularly. I say to guys, especially if they're starting to feel bad about themselves, I say, for every one of you, there's 10 guys out there that aren't doing the work, aren't brave enough to come in. I talk about bravery and courage. And I really believe it. I'm not just saying this. I really believe that when a man comes in that door, he's taking a risk that many men cannot take. So I always say, I respect you for coming in. This is great. You're a hero or whatever. Something to make him feel like he's doing something that's really positive. Be aware of any negative countertransfer and deal with it quickly. This is a tricky one. Guys come in my office and they say things about their wives that make my skin crawl. Guys come in and, the client I have the hardest time with is the shutdown male, because I had a shutdown ex-husband, and I want to strangle them. And I feel like I have to learn that there's a reason they're shut down, and I have to work with it and go slowly. It's hard for me to go slowly. It's not my style. But I know that I can't, if I'm scaring people off and I have my countertransference, which for me is more about emotionally shut down men than abusive men. Everyone has their own countertransference. We all have our own experiences, right? So it's just important to kind of be aware of that. And I think one of the best ways to deal with that is to be in good supervision or therapy. I think that is really important. And then learn how men may express affective disorders differently than women. You all know depression, right? We know it clinically. If you look at the DSM-4, it is basically about how women exhibit depression, and Bill Pollack has a really nice piece in one, I think it's the book that Cochran and Rabinowitz wrote about deepening therapy with men, about how men really express and show depression very differently. And it's important to know that, because when a man comes in your office and he's depressed, but he's basically shut down, and you say, you're depressed, and he says, no, that doesn't mean he's not depressed. It's just not a word he's going to use. And you have to ask him differently in order to get it. Now, what can go wrong? Well, a bunch of things. You can move too fast and scare them off. You can use girl talk, and that just is different than guy talk, and it's more, it's softer, it's using it's more emotional, it's more vulnerable, and I think it's important maybe to work with a man and say, how does this sound to you? Get a man's perspective. But I try to use more guy talk. It's a little more action-oriented, a little less feelings-oriented. Pathologizing the client, this happens a lot. And I talked earlier about how in the very first session, if you spend all the time talking about what's not working, you've kind of inherently pathologized them. Ignoring negative transference, I talked about that before. Getting defensive, this is an easy one when you're working with a man who's putting women down or putting you down. I have a friend who had a client who was very negative in the first session, and she talked about his sort of doing a DSM, doing the Beck depression inventory on him, and one of the questions was, how is your sexual life? And he said something like, well, I'd fuck you right now if I could, so does that answer your question? Very hostile, right? Now, we could get defensive on that. That's kind of a very hostile comment, but we have to understand it. The best thing to do is to say something like, you've answered the question, or even something like, well, I'll take that as a compliment, but let's move on. But what a lot of people do is to pull away or to get defensive or say, that's inappropriate. And when you say things like that's inappropriate, I think you've kind of lost them. Hiding behind your role. Again, you're a person first, not a therapist first, so I'll show you a clip in a minute of a person who's hiding behind a role. And that doesn't work because it means that men feel more uncomfortable in that situation. Siding with the female in couples counseling. that's again kind of natural for us because we're a woman, and I think we have to be careful we don't do that. And again, the clip I'm going to show, the woman does that, and it just doesn't work well. Letting your countertransference get the better of you. Again, that's what we talked about. And then being scared of sexual overtones. This is something that when I've talked to younger women is one of the scariest things for them, is how do you handle a sexual transference? And I have to believe with almost any straight man, there's some sexual transference. I actually had a lesbian client and there was sexual transference, and of course I wasn't thinking, and I was wearing a skirt, and she said, I can see all the way up your skirt, and I'm like, I kind of didn't know how to handle that. My supervisor said I should have said, well, what do you see? But I kind of, it sort of freaked me out, and I think I kind of lost her at that point, because I feel like you cannot shame someone for saying things. You cannot be afraid of that. So we'll talk a little bit about how to handle the sexual transference. And one of the best things you can do is to be, a friend of mine runs men's groups, and she was wearing red high heels, and one guy said, wow, those look like knee pumps, right? And she said, well, thank you. And he went, oops, and she said, well, thank you. And he went, oh, I was just trying to say how nice you looked. And she said, I appreciate that, and then it kind of went into a different direction. He felt accepted, not shamed. She thought about, what that meant, and it was in many ways a man's way of showing a compliment to her, not like the first client that was hostile. That was very hostile. But that was just saying, I appreciate you're a woman, you look nice. And one of the best ways to disarm that kind of comment is just to say thank you. Then you can look at it later. You might say later, I'm kind of curious as to why you said that. But if you shame someone, even with that comment before, which was very hostile, if you shame them, I think it's going to really be difficult. So let's talk briefly about different types of men, and I find these are the 5 maybe most difficult kinds of men to work with. The shutdown client. This is the client who comes in, I don't feel anything. The repressed client. Typically, if they're shut down, it's because they've learned not to show feelings, and what you don't want to do is to open them up too fast. Trust me, I've lost a couple of male clients, open them up. They're actually, interestingly enough, both German. I don't know if that's something to do with German men, and with abusive mothers, and when I opened them up too fast, it scared them. So you want to work with them around, you can do psychoeducation, you take your time, you have the action plan, and you just are very gentle with them. You don't go for the emotional expression right away, because they're shut down for a reason. And that reason can really be the heart of the matter, but if you go too quickly to it, you'll scare them off. The reluctant client, I don't want to be here. You might get that in couples counseling, you might get that. Anybody have court referred folks? And that I'm not familiar, my clientele is mostly, they come through insurance, they're well educated, they're self-referred, they're not domestically violent, they haven't been in jail, so it's a fairly healthy population. I'm not that familiar with court-ordered folks, but I think a lot of what I'm talking about works with them too. I have worked with some adolescent males who didn't want to be there, and I would say something like, well, I know you don't want to be here, so I'd ally with them. And I'd say, I don't blame you, and I'd ally with them. And then I'd say, but given that your school is requiring you to be here, what can we do with this? How can we work together? Because I agree that they don't want to be there. I say, I don't blame you. And then, but here's the situation. What do you think we can do together? What would work for you, right? And I think in couples counseling, men are reluctant often because they feel they're going to get slammed, and I think often they do. So I work with them, again, the hero. Thank you for coming in. I really appreciate it. I know it's, you're coming in here to help your wife, reframe, positive reframe. I tell you, the positive reframe really is good. You want to kind of, and you just work with them, because remember, it's hard for them to be there. The angry client, this scares people. Anger scares people. And I think it scares women in particular, because we've had angry men in our lives who've hurt us, or we know someone's been hurt, or just open up the newspaper, right? So I think that this is one of the biggest, most important things, is how do you work with an angry client if you're a woman? I think you welcome the anger. I think you reframe it. You say, this is a place you can get angry, but here are the boundaries depending on where you work. You can't scream so loud that someone's going to come in. You can't, I have an encounter bat in my office. You can use that, or pillows. I say, tell me about your anger. What's going on? Why do you feel it? What triggers it? What's behind it? And if they're angry with me, if I've had borderline clients angry with me, I say, I'm not afraid of it. I say, tell me why you're angry. And then sometimes they're justified, and I say, I don't blame you. I did do that wrong. I was late for that session, and I'm sorry.